Hi there everyone, it's Joe, and we're talking about starter decks again today, and this time we're going to be talking about the Final Fantasy IX starter deck, which was released fairly recently, and following the same rules as the rest of the Starter Deck Re-volved series, this deck's only going to have 2 hero cards and 0 legend cards, so it's going to be pretty strict. And this deck is going to be based on Fire Water, as is the starter deck, and the main objective of this deck is to try and accumulate card advantage way over your opponent just by drawing lots and lots of cards and trying to overwhelm your opponent with the amount that you have, as well as demonstrating the power of EX bursts. So, like the rest of the starter decks, this deck has 23 forwards, 18 backups and 9 summons. So we'll just go straight in with the card explanations now. Starting with the forwards, we're going to go in for Fire first, and we're going to begin with 2 copies of Amarant, who is a card that's in the starter deck, and Amarant is just a nice big beefy character that can, pave the way by throwing other units at other units in order to remove them out of the way. There's a lot of removal in this deck, though it's done in very, very different ways to what you might expect, unlike the Final Fantasy Type 0 deck that was posted fairly recently. So Amarant is one of your big units, so you can attack with just him, or you can use him to kind of fling your other units, because bear in mind that the objective of this deck is to accumulate card advantage. You can afford to spend some of these units throwing them at others. And then we're going to go in with 2 copies of Larn, which is the hero card that we're going to have in this deck, and that's because Larn is just generally a very good character, and he's not been played as much as he should be recently. Larn is a character that can't be blocked by anything that's bigger than him, so it's, because a lot of the units in this deck are smaller, you can use this guy to get around a lot of the bigger ones, because then they have to answer you with, something that they have, and because you're accumulating the card advantage, they may not be able to do that. And then we're going with 2 copies of Warrior of Light. The Warrior of Light is also a very, very good cheap unit that can kind of blockade bigger units from attacking you, or you can attack with Warrior of Light in order to make him, in order to provide a threat that your opponent isn't going to want to block with anything that's 4 CP or bigger. And then we're going to have 2 Imaginary Brawler, which kind of sits very nicely next to Larn as something that makes things harder to block, or makes your things harder to block. It's on curve at 7k for 3 CP, so it just kind of made sense to put in this deck. And then to round off the fire forwards, we've got 3 copies of the starter deck Vivi, who I think is very, very good anyway. He's just a very good card. So honestly, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't put this here, because you can use it to remove anything that could block Larn, or could block after Imaginary Brawler goes off, things like that. Basically, you're trying to just manipulate the field with this deck, and Vivi helps you do that a heck of a lot. Going into Waterfall, so I want to quickly explain that a Final Fantasy IX draw engine has been doing the rounds a lot recently when it comes to Final Fantasy TCG, and a big part of that is Steiner. Now, when Steiner was revealed, people said that he was rubbish, and I made a Card of the Week video on him a while ago, highlighting why that isn't the case. And so I wanted to feature him in this deck. Just the fact that he's in the deck is also very, very helpful. As an EX burst, it's something that you definitely want to keep note of, because EX bursts are part of what make this deck as good as it is. And you have access to practically every card in your deck using this card, so there was absolutely no reason not to run at least 2 of it. You could run 3 even if you wanted to move it around a little bit. The deck is for you to take and for you to try out, so it's entirely up to you if you want to change it around. And then, because we don't have access to things like Minwu because of the strict rules of no more than 2 heroes, I've decided to put 2 copies of Larsa into this deck, because I actually think Larsa is quite good anyway. He has Minwu's effect of none of your forwards being able to take damage unless it kills them, and he also has the ability, which a lot of people forget when Larsa's on the board, to boost one of your blocking forwards' power by 2000, and that can actually really save you in a pinch if you're careful with it. And then we're going to go with 3 copies of Quina, who is one of the other kind of powerhouses of this set. Quina gets more powerful depending on how many cards are in your hand, and this whole deck is built around trying to accumulate as much cards in your hand as possible, so it makes perfect sense for Quina to be a prominent part of this deck. Quina and Amarant together can practically kill anything if you know how to use them. Then we're going to go with 2 copies of Garnet, because I think that it's nice that Garnet is contained within the starter deck, and as this is a deck that is accumulated around building card advantage yet again, I wanted to make sure that it was a way to summon your Moogles and Fairies out from your deck, which obviously come in the deck, which is very handy, so you don't have to go looking for older cards as much. But Garnet is just another way to accumulate a hand advantage. She's something cheap that you can kind of throw out or block with if you need to. She's just, she's there for the draw power more than anything. And then lastly, we're going with a single copy of Cecil from Opus 1. And because I think the Cecil is actually quite a good card, especially for beginning players, because it means that you can play this card and have no fear of your opponent's combat tricks or anything, unless they're ones that don't target. Things like Golem, or any abilities that buff units, don't really work while Cecil's on the board, because they have to target him. And obviously if you want to protect your Amarant or you want to protect your Queener or anything like that, then you have the ability to do that using Cecil. So I actually wanted to put one copy of this Cecil into this deck. And then lastly, we've got 2 light forwards in the deck, which are 2 copies of Zidane. I chose to go with 2 copies rather than 3, because like the Type 0 deck and the example I gave with Ace, I think that if a light forward doesn't have an S ability or any means of using extra copies of it in your hand, you only really need 2 copies of it. And I think that that's exemplified in this deck because there's so many search cards for Zidane that you really shouldn't need to go looking for him particularly hard. And the fact that he costs 2 pretty much all the time in this deck is a massive bonus for him. So I definitely think you want at least 2 of him. So now we're venturing into the backups, and for fire backups I've decided to start with 2 copies of Bard. Now Bard is a very, very interesting card in this deck because you're trying to accumulate such a massive board. A card like Bard that can just do a blanket effect power boost to all of your units can actually win you the game. So think of it like Overrun in Magic the Gathering. It can be used in a very similar fashion where you just kind of go, okay, this is the turn that I'm aiming to kill you. I'm going to crack this Bard, make all of my guys stronger, and just throw them all at you and see what happens. You have to be careful when you use it, obviously, but it's definitely a very powerful card in this deck. And then we're going with 2 copies of Red Mage for very much the same reason. It's, making your opponent unable to block is just a very powerful ability in any game. So, making your opponent unable to stop you from hitting them is a very, very powerful ability. And because you have Larn and Imaginary Brawler in this deck, Red Mage just exemplifies that and amplifies the ability to make it difficult for your opponent to stop you doing what you want to do. So I definitely wanted to have copies of that in here. And then we've gone with a single copy of Black Waltz 2 because it's an EX burst, which is reliant on the cards in hand. So I think that it's a nice, nice card to be able to throw in here, and it comes in the starter deck as well, so it's very, very nice to have. I would have normally put in the common VV from Opus 3 because it's a little bit more consistent than Black Waltz and it's cheaper, but because we're running the starter deck VV, the forward, we don't really have room to be able to play that. And then we're going with 2 copies of Teller. Because there's a lot of weaker units in this deck, larger units might cause a problem. So basically, another big feature of this deck is being able to remove larger forwards from your opponent's board in order to make it so that things like your Larns, or your Larns, your Imaginary Brawlers, etc., you're just constantly like picking apart your opponent's kind of smaller forwards as well, so that your guys are much harder to block. But if they've got for guys that are too big for you, then Teller can help you with that by being able to deal 9,000 to a unit. And he's actually a very good call to some of the more popular cards in the game right now, so it's actually worth having him anyway. And then we're going with a single copy of Rain, because yet again, it's nice to have an EX burst available. She also searches for her brother Larn, who is one of the main features of this deck. So I always, when it comes to Larn and Rain, or a unit that searches specifically for another unit, I tend to try and favour running one less copy of the searcher than the unit he or she is searching for. So because I'm running 2 Larns in this deck, I've decided to only go with 1 Rain. And then lastly for fire forwards, we've gone with a copy of Selfie, who is an Opus 2 common, because she's just generally very good. Being able to just give a guy 2,000 power is always nice, especially if it's somebody like Larn who plan on blocking him with something that has even power with him, you have both Rain and Selfie to be able to stop them from being able to kill him. And the same applies to Imaginary Brawler, although obviously Rain doesn't work on her. So it's just a nice way of making your guys really difficult to block. Now, a large amount of the water backups in this deck are generally geared towards making it so your hand is as big as possible for just to have a big hand, really. There's no real disadvantage to having lots of cards in your hand. And we're going to start with 2 copies of Echo. Because practically every card, forward in this deck is a Final Fantasy IX forward, 2 copies of the Searcher make perfect sense to me. And in combination with Steiner and Rain, and all sorts of other things, you just have so many search abilities that it just, your deck has so much more consistency than just building up a starter deck would. But luckily, Echo comes in the starter deck anyway, as does Steiner, so that's just, the deck is pretty good from the get-go. You don't actually have to add all that much into it. And then we're going with 2 copies of FF9's Mog, because it's all part of the same engine. Generally, the Final Fantasy IX engine is Steiner, Zidane, Echo, and Mog. The reason for that is because Steiner can search up Echo or Mog. Echo and Steiner can search up Zidane, and Mog is like a nice tack on the end to just have a free backup that draws you a card and can bounce cards to your opponent's hand. Now, I've gone with 2 copies of Mog here, where a lot of people only run 1, primarily because we're running it from starter deck, and I think that it's nice to be able to have extra abilities to bounce cards to your opponent's hand. And then we go with 2 copies of Geomancer. Geomancer is a card that I really like, but I know a lot of people don't, and the reason for that is because it allows you to kind of tilt the odds in your favour. When your opponent attacks you, you can dull your Geomancer to look at the top card of your deck in response to the attack, and have a look and see if there's an EX burst on top, and if there isn't, you can put it to the bottom, and if there is, you leave it on the top. And I've always liked that ability because I think that, you know, people who claim that relying on luck is a bad thing is true. You shouldn't rely on luck, but there's nothing wrong with trying to tilt the odds in your favour, and this card allows you to do that, and that's why I like it. And then I've gone with a single copy of Quattro Queen because, you know, given that this deck is all about swarming forwards, it makes sense to have a copy of this in the deck in order to power boost your guy as much as possible. Like, similarly to how legendary Tidus works from Opus 1, he gets stronger depending on how many friends he has. Quattro Queen works very much in the same way, so I wanted to run a single copy of that. It's only one copy because it is 4 CP. And then a single copy of Artemisian because, yet again, it's a nice card that's in the starter deck, and because you know, the whole deck is built around consistency, there are hands that you're going to draw that aren't going to be that great, but a single copy of Artemisian that you draw, even after you've mulliganed and put your hand to the bottom once and drawn up a new hand, it allows you to kind of keep, you know, the consistency up. In the early game, you probably discard Artemisian late game because you won't need him as much, but I do think it's very nice to have a one-off in the deck, and I think it's even possible to run copies of Artemisian in, you know, fully constructed decks as well, so I definitely like this card, and it's something I think that you should try out. And then lastly, I've gone with a single copy of Scholar because I think that Scholar is ordinarily used to save your units from being killed. But in this deck, because you have quite a lot of come into play effects, things like Zidane and Steiner and things like that, it allows you to repeat them. And I want to kind of teach new players the ability to kind of break their backups in order to make room for new ones, because you very quickly realise that 5 backup spaces get filled up very, very quickly, and you actually want the abilities from your backups more than you think. So I think having a copy of Scholar will teach that, and it allows people to kind of get the ideas of combos and things like that into their heads as well, so I wanted to run one copy of that. Now lastly, with the summons, 6 out of the 9 summons in this deck draw you a card, and that's a big part of the theme of this deck. It's all about drawing cards, adding cards to hand, searching cards, blah 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 blah. But the first one, and the only fire summon in this deck, because I don't think many of the other fire summons really go with this deck all that well, is Belias, and there's 3 copies of it in here. But the reason for Belias is that he, you know, having a combat trick like your opponent can't see is always a very, very strong thing. First Strike can do a lot of things for you as well, and the ability that it draws a card, the fact that it draws a card on the end as well is just icing on the cake. It just seemed like a perfect natural fit for this deck. And then on the water side, we've got 3 copies of Leviathan, because I always run 3 copies of Leviathan. I think it is one of the strongest summons in the game. It's not particularly hard to acquire, and it's just generally very, very good. It's so multi-purpose, and having an EX burst like that, it doesn't kill things, which means that, you know, certain cards, they can't be targeted or killed. Things like that, I don't like Leviathan very much. It's just very, very generally very generally useful. It's not perfect, but it's very, very good in a lot of situations. And then the last 2 summons are both cards that are generally there just to draw a card. I've gone with 2 copies of Fairy and 1 copy of Moogle rather than the other way around, purely because Fairy does give you a secondary effect, and the ability to activate your Amarant and use it again might come in handy, whereas, you know, Moogle, having the draw 2, drop 1, it does add to consistency, but in a game like Final Fantasy, you do quickly discover that because you draw 2 cards a turn anyway, that's not as important as it might seem. And I learned this the hard way, because when I was playing the game, when Opus 1 was out, I swore by 3 Moogle in every deck. Absolutely swore by it because I've been playing other games for so long. But I've gone with only 1 here and 2 Fairy instead because, as I've said, you do quickly come to understand that it's not because you're using the Moogle and you might have to, you know, the card advantage in this game works slightly differently than it does to every other game. So just bear that in mind when you're playing this deck. And that's it for this video. As I've said, you know, this deck is very much geared towards people who enjoy just building card advantage and drawing tons of cards. So share this video out with anyone who might be interested in getting into the Final Fantasy trading card game, or if anyone like me, I was actually very excited to make this video, is a Final Fantasy IX nut, because I love my Final Fantasy IX and have done since I was about 12 or 13. Then share this video out with them, and thank you very, very much for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll leave all the links and everything to my social media in the description box if you want to contact me in any way. And you can look forward to the Final Fantasy 7, 13 and 10 decks coming up very, very soon as well. So thank you again for watching, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.